Over the past year, I've started to focus on the Famicom system. It's been a great experience finding and playing games for the Famicom, and in a way, it's reintroduced me to the feeling of playing games I've never seen or heard of before. One of the challenges I ran into when starting to go into the Famicom was, where the hell do I start? Being that the majority of games are in Japanese, and I'm not particularly crafty at learning languages, I felt pretty intimidated at first when starting to look around. So to maybe help someone out, or just to start a good conversation, I put together a 10-game Famicom starter list that gives you a good taste of what the Famicom has to offer. Now this is not a top 10 best Famicom games list, far from it. This is more of a good starter list that gives you some great titles to enjoy without breaking the bank, having to learn Japanese, or a game that has a ton of learning curves involved. Before we get to the list, I think it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about the various ways you can play Famicom games in the United States. Yes, emulation is always an option, but I'm a hardware purist, so if you don't have to plug a bunch of shit in or connect a bunch of shit together, it doesn't really count. First off, you can just go buy a Famicom converter. You can get these for about 10 to 20 bucks online. They work pretty well, but they're not my first choice, since I've had problems with some of them in the past. For example, the last one I bought, I put one game in and somehow it bent all the pins down, so now it doesn't work anymore. It's a cheap solution, but sometimes you get what you pay for. You can also run around trying to find a Famicom to NES converter in some Gyromite carts. It's fun to look around and have a scale with you and weigh them out and see if you can find one that weighs a little bit more, because that might mean that you have a converter inside. Personally, I think it's kind of a waste, since you have to destroy the cart to get the converter out. Next, you could buy some reproduction carts. Some people get really pissy about repro carts, but personally I don't care. You get the game you want to play, and in some cases you get it with translation, which for some Famicom games is the only way some of us will get to play it. There are great websites out there like Retro USB, OCD Reproductions, and the NESDump.com that have tons of reproduction carts out there in pristine translations and everything you could ever want. I very highly recommend checking out some of these websites and looking around at some of the reproduction Famicom carts that they have and picking a couple up. Lastly, just buy a damn Famicom. Seriously, it's 2016 and we can get anything we want on eBay now. I'd personally recommend shelling out for a Famicom AV model. It's basically the top loader and has composite out, so it takes care of all your connection needs. With all these options out there, there's really no excuse not to get into the Famicom. So without further delay, let's get to the Retro Safari Top 10 Starter Famicom Games. At number 10 we have WAGYAN Land 2. Now I know what you're thinking, why the hell would I want to play a kid's game? Well, I included it on my list for 3 reasons. 1, it's kind of a fun platformer. 2, it's super cheap. And 3, you can use it to learn a little bit of Japanese. In WAGYAN Land 2, you control WAGYAN, a mechanical dragon that has to protect WAGYAN Land from Dr. Devil, or some shit like that. Each level is pretty easy to get through, but it's the boss fights that make the game pretty interesting. Some of the fights you have to make sentences in Japanese. You have to play rock, paper, scissors, match or complete musical phrases, or track down numbers. I found this game to be pretty fun despite the simplicity, and it gave me a good kick in the pants to try to learn some Japanese. WAGYAN Land has a bunch of games in the series, so if you don't like WAGYAN Land 2, you can find about 8 other games in the series to try out. In at number 9 we have one of the weirdest, cutest games I've ever played, YUME Penguin Monogatari. In this game you play a penguin with a weight problem who has to lose weight in order to win back his girl. Yes, you heard that right, you're a fat ass penguin who has to diet to win his woman back from some other penguin. Throughout the game you have to avoid eating food, which I found to be an interesting twist on the standard game mechanic of food equals good things. The game is super fun and really easy to play without knowing Japanese. There are some great repro carts in this game too, so YUME Penguin Monogatari is a must-have Famicom game. At number 8, I put Kid NIKI 3. Kid NIKI has quickly become one of my favorite game franchises for the Famicom. Kid NIKI 3 is unique in that it is very different from the previous 2 Kid NIKI games. You use a staff instead of a sword, you have lots of different special abilities, and who doesn't like a game with pissing boy statues? I found Kid NIKI 3 to have a lot of replayability, and it really hit a great spot in terms of gameplay versus difficulty. Kid NIKI 3 is easiest to get as a reproduction cart, since the Famicom one can command some outrageous prices. At number 7 is Holy Diver, a game with references to Dio, Ozzy, Randy Rhoads, Zakk Wylde, King Crimson, and Slayer. Where do I sign up? Holy Diver feels a lot like Castlevania in that it's an action platformer with spells and a really creepy Halloween kind of vibe. The only reason it's not higher on my list is that it is literally one of the hardest games ever created for the Nintendo, Famicom, or video games in general. If you think I'm kidding, just try it. It'll chew you up and spit you out before you get out of the first level. Not only is the game difficult as hell, it also has a ton of randomness, which means you can get really far into a level and just get bad luck and lose out. You're likely going to buy this game as a repro cart because it's one of those Famicom games that just commands ridiculous prices currently. Number 6. The Goonies. Back in the day, it used to royally piss me off when I would see Goonies 2. I mean, where the hell was Goonies 1? Little did I know there indeed was a Goonies 1, but it was only in Japan. Goonies 1 is more of an arcadey version of Goonies 2, where you have to gather keys to open a door within a certain time limit. It's about half as cryptic as Goonies 2, which is what makes it a great game to have. You can argue that the gameplay is simple, but to me that's what makes it really great and sustainable. My only real complaint about the game is the Goonies are all nondescript. It would have been really cool to have one Goonies game that had sort of a Mega Man feel to it and that you could switch characters and have different abilities. At number 6, The Goonies. At number 5, we have Kid NIKI 2. Kid NIKI 2 is on here and higher than Kid NIKI 3 because in my opinion, it's a better all-around game. It retains some of the lighthearted humor from Kid NIKI 1, but still keeps the gameplay fresh with new abilities such as being able to turn into different animals at any level. This to me adds a ton of replayability and lets you figure out multiple ways to complete a level. So often early games make you slug your way through each level using the same mechanics over and over again. It's nice once in a while to come across a game that you can beat and come back to again. At number 5, Kid NIKI 2. Kid Dracula ends up at number 4 on my list, though for many it could be their number 1. To be honest, this game was one of the primary motivators for getting into the Famicom. Like Kid NIKI 2, it's an action platformer with special abilities. Kid Dracula looks a little bit more like Doc Brown the Dracula, and it's definitely one of those holy shit ramp up difficulty games. About 85% of the game is pretty easy. Then you get to the last 2 levels. I really hope you like the way they look because you will spend an ass load of time on them trying to beat them. It's satisfying to beat, but frustrating as hell. This game is practically a must-have if you get into Famicom games. There are also a ton of reproductions out there if you'd like to try to find one with some save states or some extra enhancements. At number 4, Kid Dracula. At number 3, we have Splatterhouse, or WANPAKU Graffiti. This game is one of my favorite games of all time, period. It's a comedic rendition of the classic Splatterhouse game. In the game you play as Rick, a recently resurrected man with a Jason mask chasing down his girlfriend Jennifer that has been kidnapped by the Pumpkin King. The gameplay is super simple but full of comedy. You have things like dancing Dracula, killer dolls, and your character is healed with candy. This game also has multiple endings which adds to the replay value. To me, this game was one of the best games I have ever played and is incredibly satisfying to beat. You can get the Famicom version fairly cheap, and you don't really need to worry about translations here. There are also a ton of reproductions available. The battle between number 2 and number 1 was very intense for me. These 2 games are some of the absolute best games I have ever played. COCORON was developed by the same guy that did Mega Man. He also did this really mediocre and incredibly overpriced game that you might have heard of called Little Samson, but we'll talk about that later. After playing all three, I really believe COCORON was the best of them. I still don't know why it's not talked about that much. I guess it's the subject matter, which can be a bit weird. I've played it a few times and I still don't really get the plot 100%. What I do get is a really kick-ass game with an insane amount of replayability, since you can create custom characters. Do you want a guy that's hard to kill but can't really jump? Done. Want a dude that throws pencils as his primary attack? Sure. Want a dude that flies? No problem. COCORON lets you really design your character the way that you want, and that can lead to a lot of really enjoyable gameplay. This game might be better as a repro that's translated, since some of the initial setup you go through might be tricky as a non-Japanese speaker. However, it's pretty easy to figure out if you have some patience. Before I reveal number 1, I do have to list one quick honorable mention game. This isn't really a Famicom game per se, but it's nonetheless a great gem in the Famicom library. That game is Miracle of ALMANA for the Famicom Disk System. There's an incredible reproduction card available from the NES dump, which includes a translated game, manual, and original box. And I promise you, it is worth every single penny. I did a review a while back of this game, but the TLDR version is the game basically is Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom. It was a game that I really wish was released in the US, and I cannot recommend getting this game enough. And now for number 1, Mad City. I have to admit I'm pretty biased towards this game because I am a huge fan of the Adventures of Bayou Billy. Mad City is the Famicom version of Bayou Billy, and to me, it is the perfect version. Bayou Billy has it all. Brawler beat-em-up levels with some awesome weapons and enemies, light gun or controller-based shooting levels, and driving levels. You couple all that gameplay with a fantastic soundtrack, and it's a hell of a game. The only problem is the US version is harder than taking a shit after eating 2 pounds of cheese. It is beyond frustrating. Mad City retains all the kick-assness, but does not have the difficulty factor. Literally, if you look at the damage you take in the US version, it is nearly double the damage you take in the Famicom version. And that lower difficulty really creates an addicting balance of challenge and gameplay. No longer do you have to sit and sweat with maximum effort to try to beat the first screen of the US version. You get a balanced and fair challenge, and to me, that is the reason why it's the number 1 game to get on the Famicom. There are a few examples of Famicom games being different than their US counterparts, but to me this is one of the ones with the most benefit, and that's why I say it's worth getting. It's also not that expensive. We got a complete in-box version for about $40. Coupling all this together is why Mad City lands at number 1 on my list of starter Famicom games. And there you have it. Again, this list is not a top 10 Famicom games of all time list. It's more of a list of games that are worth getting if you're starting out in the Famicom world. I think these games are all fun to play, don't break the bank, and don't require a ton of Japanese to be able to play. I hope you found this list useful and entertaining, and I hope you get the chance to embark on your own Famicom adventure. Thanks for watching.